Roland Barthes' style and its image. I should like to begin with a personal consideration. For some 20 years, my investigations have been concerned with literary language, without my being altogether comfortable in the role either of critic or of linguist. I should like to take advantage of this ambiguous situation in order to deal with an impure notion, one which has at once a metaphoric form and a theoretical concept. This notion is an image. I do not believe, as a matter of fact, that scientific work can proceed without a certain image of its object. As we know, nothing is more resolutely metaphoric than the language of mathematicians or geographers. Nor do I believe that the intellectual image, heir of ancient Pythagorean cosmogonies, at once spatial, musical, and abstract, can be divested of a theoretical value which preserves it from contingency without exaggeratedly deflecting it toward abstraction. Hence, it is an image which I seek to question, or, more specifically, a vision. How do we see style? What is the image of style which troubles me? What is the one I desire? Simplifying greatly the privilege of vision, it seems to me that style, in the current sense of the word, has always been part of a binary system, or, if you prefer, of a mythological paradigm of two terms. These terms have, of course, changed names and even content according to periods and schools. Let us consider two of these oppositions. The first, the oldest, it is still with us, at least quite frequently in the teaching of literature, is that of content and form. It derives, we know, from one of the first classifications of classical rhetoric, the opposition between res and verba. On res, or demonstrative materials of discourse, depends inventio, or research into what one can say about a subject, quaestio. On verba depends elocutio, or transformation of these materials into a verbal form. This elocutio is, roughly, our style. The relation of form and content is phenomenological. Form is reputed to be the appearance or garment of content, which is its truth or body. The metaphors attached to form, to style, are therefore of a decorative order. Figures, colors, nuances. Or again, this relation of form and content is experienced as expressive or alethic. The writer or the commentator must establish a proper relation between content, truth, and form, appearance, between message as content and its medium, style. Between these two concentric terms, the one being inside the other, is assumed the reciprocal guarantee. This guarantee gives rise to a historical problem. Can form disguise content, or must it be subservient to it so that there can no longer be a coded form? It is this argument which sets in opposition, down through the centuries, Aristotelian, later Jesuit, rhetoric and Platonic, later Pascalian, rhetoric. This vision subsists despite terminological change when we consider the text as the superposition of a signified and a signifier, the signified then being inevitably experienced, I am speaking here of a more or less assumed vision, as a secret hidden behind the signifier. The second, much more recent opposition, of a more scientific aspect and largely tributary of the Saussurean paradigm, langue parole, or code message is that of norm and deviance. Style is then seen as the exception, though coded, to a rule. It is the individual, yet institutional aberration of a current usage, sometimes perceived as verbal, if we define the norm by the spoken language, sometimes as prosaic, if we set poetry in opposition to something else. Just as the opposition form-content implies a phenomenological vision, so the norm-deviance opposition implies an ultimately moral vision under cover of a logic of endoxa. There is a reduction of the systematic to the sociological. The code is what is statistically guaranteed by the greatest number of users, and of the sociological to the normal, where social nature begins. Literature, the space of style, and because it is specifically this space, then assumes a shamanic function, which Lévi-Strauss has well described in his introduction to the work of Marcel Mauss. It is the site of verbal anomaly, as society establishes, recognizes, and assumes it by honoring its writers, in the same way that the ethnic group establishes the supernatural in the person of the witch doctor, the way an abscess marks the limits of a disease, in order to recuperate it in a process of collective communication. I should like to start from these two visions, less to attack them than to complicate them. Let us take first the opposition of content and form, of signified and signifier. No doubt it includes a certain irreducible portion of truth. Structural analysis of narrative in its achievements and its promises is wholly based on the conviction and a practical proof that we can transform a given text into a more schematic version whose meta-language is no longer the integral language of the original text, without changing the narrative identity of this text. In order to enumerate functions, to reconstitute sequences, or to distribute agents, in short, to bring to light a narrative grammar which is no longer the grammar of the vernacular of the text, we must peel off the stylistic, or more generally elocutionary, expressive film from another layer of secondary narrative meaning, to which the stylistic features have no pertinence. They can be varied without affecting the structure. That Balzac should say of a disturbing old man that he kept upon his bluish lips a fixed and paralyzed smile, as implacable and jeering as the smile of a death's head, has exactly the same narrative, or more precisely semantic function, as if we were to transform the phrase and say that the old man had something funereal and fantastic about him. This seme is irreducible, since it is functionally necessary to the sequence of the story. The error, however, and it is here that we must modify our vision of content and form, would be to stop peeling off style prematurely. What is possible, as we have just said, peeling off reveals is not a content, a signified, but another form, another signifier, or if we prefer a more neutral term, another level, which is never the last, for the text is always articulated around codes which it does not exhaust. Signifieds are forms, as we have known since Hjelmslev, and even more clearly from the recent hypothesis of certain psychoanalysts, anthropologists, philosophers. Recently, analyzing a tale by Balzac, I attempted to bring to light, without reference to style, with which I was not concerned, and remaining within the boundaries of the signified, an interplay of 5 different codes: actional, hermeneutic, semic, cultural, and symbolic. The citations which the author, or more exactly the performer of the text, extracts from these codes are juxtaposed, mixed, superimposed within one and the same expressive unit, a single sentence, for example, or more generally a lexia or unit of reading, so as to form a braid, a fabric, or even etymologically a text. Here is an example. The sculptor Saracen is in love with a prima donna whom he does not know to be a castrato. He abducts her, and the apparent soprano defends herself. The Italian woman was armed with a dagger. "If you come closer," she said, "I will be forced to plunge this weapon into your heart." Is there behind the statement a signified? Not at all. The sentence is the braid of several codes: a linguistic code, the French language, a rhetorical code, antonomasia, interpolation of an inquit, apostrophe, an actional code, the armed defense of the victim is a unit in the sequence rape, a hermeneutic code, the castrato conceals his sex by feigning to defend his virtue as a woman, and a symbolic code, the knife is a symbol of castration. Hence, we can no longer see the text as the binary structure of content and form. The text is not double, but multiple. In the text, there are only forms, or more precisely, the text in its totality is only a multiplicity of forms, without a content. We can say metaphorically that the literary text is a stereography, neither melodic nor harmonic. It is resolutely contrapuntual. It mingles voices in a volume, not in a line, not even a double one. Doubtless, among these voices, these codes, these systems, these forms, some are more specially attached to verbal substance, verbal play, linguistics, rhetoric. But this is a historical distinction, useful only for the literature of the signified, which is in general the only literature that we have studied. For we need merely think of a few modern texts to see that as the narrative, logic, symbolic, psychological, signified recedes still further, it is not possible to set in opposition, even with the greatest sensitivity to nuance, systems of form and systems of content. Style is a historical and not universal concept, which has pertinence only for certain historic works. Does it have within this older literature a definite function? I believe it does. The stylistic system, which is one system among others, has a function of naturalization or of familiarization or of domestication. The units of the codes of content are in effect subjected to a rough pigeonholing. Actions are separated, characterial and symbolic notations are disseminated, the march of truth is fragmented, retarded. Language, in the elementary aspects of sentence, period, paragraph, superimposes upon the semantic discontinuity established on the level of discourse the appearance of continuity. For however discontinuous language itself may be, its structure is so fixed in the experience of each man that he recognizes it as a veritable nature. Do we not speak of the flux of speech? What is more familiar, more obvious, more natural than a sentence read? Style overspreads the semantic articulations of content. By metonymic means, it naturalizes the story told, declares it innocent. Now, let us turn to the second opposition, that of norm and deviance, which is in effect the opposition of code and message, since style, or literary effect, is experienced here as an aberrant message which surprises the code. Here, too, we must refine our vision of the opposition rather than destroy it. The features of style are undeniably drawn from a code, or at least from a systematic space. This distinction seems necessary if we want to respect the possibility of a multicode, or even the existence of a signifier whose space is governed and yet infinite. It is an unsaturable paradigm. Style is a distance, a difference, but in relation to what? The reference is most often, implicitly or explicitly, to the spoken, current, normal language. This proposition seems to me both excessive and insufficient. Excessive, because stylistic codes of reference or difference are numerous, and the spoken language is always only one of these codes, which, moreover, there is no reason to privilege as the princeps language, the incarnation of the fundamental code, the absolute reference. Insufficient, because the opposition of spoken and written is never exploited in all its depth. A word on this last point. We know that the object of linguistics, what determines at once its task and its limits, is the sentence, however difficult to define. Beyond the sentence, there is no linguistics, for here discourse begins, and the combinative rules of sentences are different from those of monemes. But, short of this, there is no linguistics either, for then we can expect to find only shapeless, incomplete, unworthy syntagms. Only the sentence, we feel, guarantees organization, structure, unity. Now, the interior language, the language of thought, is essentially a sub-sentence language. Of course, it can include complete sentences, but the code of the genre does not require this for the success and advantage of the communication. We constantly talk without finishing our sentences. Listen to a conversation. Note how many sentences there are whose structure is incomplete or ambiguous, how many clauses are subordinated with no main clause or with no clear antecedent, how many subjects lack predicates, how many adversatives lack correlatives, etc. To the point where it is abusive to continue speaking of sentences, even incomplete or defective ones. Better to speak more neutrally of syntagms whose congregation remains to be described. But if we open a book, there will not be one sentence which is not ended by an overdetermination of operators, structural, rhythmic, and punctuational. Whence, by right, to autonomous linguistics, a linguistics of the syntagm and a linguistics of the sentence, a linguistics of the spoken and the linguistics of the written. By carrying this distinction to its conclusions, we shall only be following the recommendations of philosophy, which today assigns speech and writing different ontologies. It is, philosophy says, by a paradoxical abuse, that linguistics deals only with the written language in sentences, while claiming that the canonical form of language is speech, in respect to which writing is only transcription. We lack, obviously, a grammar of the spoken language, insofar as we have only a grammar of the sentence. But is this grammar of the spoken language possible? Is it not the very notion of grammar which would be eliminated by this division of communication? This lack determines a new distribution of languages. There are languages of the sentence and all the other kinds. The first are marked by a constraining character, an obligatory rubric, the completion of the sentence. Style is obviously one of these written languages, and its generic feature, which attaches it to the genre of the written but does not yet distinguish it from its neighbors, is its requirement to complete its sentences. By its finitude, by its neatness, the sentence declares itself written, en route to its literary state. The sentence is already, in itself, a stylistic object. The absence of smudging, by which it fulfills itself, is in a sense the first criterion of style. We see this clearly in two properly stylistic values, simplicity and contour. Both are effects of neatness, one rhetoric, the other rhetorical. If this sentence of Claudel's "The night is so calm it seems salted" is both simple and contoured, it is because it completes the sentence in its necessary and sufficient plenitude. This can be related to several historical phenomena. First of all, a certain nomic inheritance of the written language, divinatory maxims, religious formulas, whose typically sentential closure assures polysemy. Then, the humanist myth of the living sentence, effluvium of an organic model, at once closed and generative, a myth discussed in the treatise on the sublime. Last, the attempts, though as yet ineffectual, so closely is literature, even subversive literature, linked to the sentence, to explode the limits of the sentence, Mallarmé's coup de dé, hyperproliferation of the Proustian sentence, destruction of the typographic sentence in modern poetry. The sentence, in its closure and its neatness, seems to me, then, the fundamental determination of writing, from which many written codes are possible, though not yet always identified. Learned, academic, administrative, journalistic writing, each describable in terms of its clientele, its lexicon, and its syntactical protocols, inversions, figures, clausulae, all features marking the identity of a collective writing by their presence or their absence. Among all these kinds of writing, and even before speaking of style, in the individual sense in which we ordinarily understand this word, there is a literary language, a truly collective writing whose systematic features should be itemized, and not only his historical features, as has been done hitherto. What is it, for instance, which is permitted in a literary text but not in an academic article? Inversions, order of complements, syntactical license, archaisms, figures, lexicon. What we must grasp first is not the idealect of an author, but of an institution, literature. This is not all. Literary writing must be located not only in relation to its closest neighbors, but also in relation to its models. I mean by models, not sources, in the philological sense of the word. Let us note in passing that the problem of sources has been raised almost exclusively on the level of content, but syntagmatic patterns, typical fragments of sentences, formulas, if you like, whose origin is not identifiable, but which make up part of the collective memory of literature. To write is to let these models come to one and to transform them, in the sense this word has acquired in linguistics. I shall point out, in this regard, three phenomena, taken virtually at random from a recent experiment. The first is personal testimony. Having worked for some time on a tale by Balzac, I often catch myself spontaneously carrying over into the circumstances of daily life fragments of sentences, formulations spontaneously taken from the Balzacian text. It is not the memorial, banal character of the phenomenon which interests me here, but the evidence that I am writing daily life, it is true, in my head, through these formulas inherited from an anterior writing. Or again, more precisely, life is the very thing which comes already constituted as a literary writing. Nascent writing is a past writing. The second phenomenon is an example of external transformation. When Balzac writes, "I was plunged into one of those profound reveries which overcome everyone, even the frivolous, in the midst of the most tumultuous festivities," the sentence, if we accept its personal mark, "I was plunged," is merely the transformation of a proverb. Amidst tumultuous festivities, profound reveries. In other words, the literary speech act refers, by transformation, to another syntactic structure. The first content of the sentence is another form, here the nomic form, and style is established in the effort of transformation applied not to ideas but to forms. It remains, of course, to identify the chief stereotypes, such as the proverb, from which literary language is invented and generated. The third phenomenon is an example of internal transformation, which the author generates from his own formula. At a certain moment of his stay at Baalbek, the Proustian narrator tries to engage a young elevator boy of the Grand Hotel in conversation, but the boy does not answer him. Proust says, "Whether from astonishment at my words, attention to his work, concern for etiquette, hardness of hearing, respect for the place, fear of danger, mental torpor, or orders of the director." The repetition of the same syntactical formula, a noun and its complement, is obviously a game, a turn, and style then consists in 1. Transforming a potential subordinate clause into a nominal syntagm, because he did not hear well becomes his hardness of hearing. 2. Repeating as often as possible this transformational formula through different contents. From these three random and virtually impromptu remarks, I should merely like to draw a working hypothesis that we consider stylistic features as transformations derived either from collective formulas of unrecoverable origin, literary or pre-literary, or by metaphoric interplay from idealectical forms. In both cases, what should govern the stylistic task is the search for models, for patterns, sentential structures, syntagmatic clichés, divisions and clausulae of sentences. And what should animate this task is the conviction that style is essentially a citational procedure, a body of formulas, a memory, almost in the cybernetic sense of the word, an inheritance based on culture and not on expressivity. This permits situating the transformation to which I allude, and consequently the transformation stylistics I can desire. It certainly has some affinity with transformational grammar, but it differs from it on one fundamental point, where linguistics, inevitably implying a certain vision of language, once again becomes ideological. Stylistic models cannot be identified with deep structures, with universal forms derived from a psychological logic. These models are only the depositories of culture, even if they seem very old. They are repetitions, not foundations, citations, not expressions, stereotypes, not archetypes. To return to that vision of style to which I alluded at the beginning, In my opinion, it must consist today in seeing style with the plurality of the text, a plurality of semantic levels, codes, whose braiding forms the text, and a plurality of citations deposited in that code we are calling style, and which I should prefer to call, at least as a first object of study, literary language. The problem of style can only be treated in relation to what I shall call the layered quality of discourse. And, to continue the elementary metaphor, I shall sum up these few remarks by saying that, if hitherto we have seen the text as a fruit with its pit, an apricot for instance, the flesh being the form and the pit the content, it would be better to see it as an onion, a superimposed construction of skins, of layers, of levels, of systems, whose volume contains, finally, no heart, no core, no secret, no irreducible principle, nothing but the very infinity of its envelopes, which envelop nothing other than the totality of its surfaces. Bellagio, Colloquium, 1969.